All right, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. This first step is probably the worst step of the entire process of just having to take the entire bag apart. You can see I'm snipping at it, pulling away the binding, trying to make good time, but you also don't want to mess up the material. But you do get to discover cool little details like this, where they reinforce that piece of webbing by folding it back and then having the binding wrap around it. Or this little detail where you could see they actually double stitch the entire closing seam of the bag. In some ways, you just find more appreciation for the product that I guess you really wouldn't see unless you completely took it apart. This is the part where I realized I need to be taking some notes. There are a lot of different subassemblies that have to get put back together in a very specific order. So I took a lot of video just so when this thing's in pieces, I would be able to look back and have a reference of basically the order of operations, just so I don't entirely f up when putting it back together. This was my first time dyeing material for any kind of project, and this footage definitely shows it. The webbing is easy, just because you can fit a lot of it in a small area. Doing the larger pieces of fabric was more challenging. You could see with this X-Pack, this is just a total mess. I later on refined my technique a little bit. I don't know why I thought this would work, of just tossing in the roll, because it only dyed the outside of the roll. So later on, I worked my way up to what I call this like scrolly, pulley kind of technique of just rolling it through, flipping it around, rolling it again. And this gave me pretty good control over, I guess, the saturation of the color that I wanted. And these are all of my finished pieces. With all the material dyed, it was now time to start cutting out the new pieces and see how this bag would start coming together. As I would cut each one, I would just fold it in half, mark center, add any other lines for reference that I needed. For this one, I needed some lines just so I knew where to put the label. For this longer piece, I basically just had to reconstruct it out of 3 shorter pieces. I was pretty limited to how much material I could dye, so this was the only long section of the bag where I had to break it up like that. Don't judge me. This move's a little illegal. Sometimes I don't want to cut multiple pieces of fabric exactly the size and then try to line it up. So I'll overcut them, lay my true piece right on top, sew it, and then trim the excess. This is where I find it really useful to have a binding set up on a cylinder arm. Either way, this could be done on a flatbed, but for tight curves like this, I can really let the work kind of wrap around the edge of the machine and get in those tight corners. And there's the top of the bag. I'm starting on one of the external pockets here, and I had actually built the other pocket off camera. You could see it there on the left, just because I'm pretty new to filming the process of something while also making it. And sometimes I feel like my brain can't handle both. So I wanted to at least sew one up to figure out the steps, figure out the changes I was going to do, and then record the process for the second one. If you want to see the most unsatisfying scissor cut, here it comes. Jesus. This is a trick I use just for nailing the same height consistency for like the loops of the daisy chain. So you could take an exact measurement of the webbing and then like how much excess you want to have and then sew on that. I find that it's quicker to just find something that gives you the amount of slack you want, like this pen does. And then I could just shove it in there. Give myself just my tacks, just to hold the webbing in place. And then I'll bring it over to the programmable, set my width of my tack that I want, and then start tacking away. For the pocket organization, this whole subassembly would have been a bit of an ordeal to take apart. So I just laid it flat, started off with chopping the overall size and adding my zipper in. I also ended up doing a double stitch just because the zipper tape I was using was a little bit wider than what was on the original bag. Then I made an oversized pocket piece just so I had enough material slack to get the volume of the pockets that I wanted. Sewed it down, traced out the original shape just so I had a reference, sewed along that line, and then trimmed the excess slack. Basically some more illegal shit, but it gives the same result, and I feel like it goes a little bit quicker than if I had taken that whole pocket assembly apart. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to figure out here, but I would rather spend the extra few minutes just double checking and making sure I know exactly what's going on than completely rush into something and eventually have to take it apart again because I missewed a step. So once I kind of got everything back on track, it's really just the same order of operations again. Since the middle of the bag is constructed out of two sides, I only had to take apart one side of it, and I could use that same pattern piece for both pieces just by flipping it over since they are symmetrical. For the two floating mesh pockets, I treated them the same as the pocket organization for the sides. So I just kind of oversized pieces, sewed them together. I would then lay the original pocket piece on top and line everything up and trim it where I needed to. And once it was complete, I was able to sew that pocket onto the main side assembly. So here's a little refresher of what we have done so far. So we have the center of the bag, we have the top, we have both of our external pockets, and then that leaves us with having to sew the bottom and the beaver tail. By this point, I was pretty over working with the dyed X-Pack. X-Pack in general seems to want to curl, especially if it's been on the roll for a while and if the roll is pretty small. These pieces, once they were dyed and dried, seemed like they just had extra curl in them. And you could see even when I cut this piece here, it just springs back. So anytime I wanted to work with it, it seemed like I had to weigh it down. In comparison, you can see how the white X-Pack that hasn't been dyed is much easier to work with. There's all kinds of little tricks for getting the zipper slides onto the tape. Some people will even 3D print a jig for it. Some people use a fork to hold the slide. Over time, I've just kind of been stubborn enough to peel the zipper tape away and slide it on. If I'm sewing something that I haven't sewn before and I don't exactly know how the pattern pieces are supposed to match, I'll usually just work off the center. So for this section here, I started on the center on one side, sewed across and got where I wanted the pieces to match. And then I flipped it over. I'll start at the center again and work my way back the other way. This just prevents me from starting at the very top end on one side, sewing all the way through and then realizing that I'm off by a small amount. For some of this, there's like a little bit of tolerance. It's not like everything has to come down to the perfect exact spot. But at this stage in the bag, there's going to be parts where seams are going to start lining up together. And since I color blocked it, I have to be pretty mindful of where these seams will go. This style folder is supposed to be able to just swing away, but in order for me to get it on my machine and to stay in place, I had to tap another hole, which now sort of defeats the purpose of it being a swing away binder. So I just undo the Allen, take out a couple screws, put in whichever folder I want to use. I rotate between one for 3/4 inch and then one for 1 inch binding tape. For this section, I'm using 1 inch. I usually try to avoid using the 1 inch when I can, just because the tape I have is a little stiff, so it can just add a bit more bulk when trying to get a seam to turn out. But the 1 inch folder in this case has a bigger mouth, so it can fit a lot of the bulkier parts of this assembly, like that zipper tape. At this point, I'm sewing the side pockets to the main center assembly of the bag. And this is where I have to be pretty mindful of where things are matching up. I'm taking it pretty slow. I have to sew a little blind in this section just because I can't fully see the zipper tape underneath. So I just have the foot hugging right up against the coil and sewing along, making sure that the bottom seam for the purple matches up. And then I'll go through and finish off that same seam with the binding. For the beaver tail, I wanted to do just some minor changes. So I had to take the original piece, bring it to paper, and then from there, pattern it out. So really the only difference is that this one is going to have the ability to fully detach from the bag. So I just copied the same angles that were at the top of the beaver tail to the bottom. And this whole piece is going to have a clean finish with some top stitching. Here I'm back to using the same little pen trick that I did for the daisy chain. on the external pockets, just so everything maintains the same amount of slack and all the webbing looks uniform across the whole bag. With the beaver tail done, all that was left was to do the final closing stitch of the bag. And then afterwards, I would trim off any of the excess binding and webbing. I like keeping those pieces on as I sew, just so I can see them a lot better and know that I'm sewing over them in the correct direction. Trim them off after, and then bring it over to the binder and do the last binding assembly. Here's the finished bag. Thanks for watching.